Out of all the North American console releases that I grew up with, Dance Dance Revolution's SuperNOVA 2 is the one that I probably remember the least about. So little, in fact, that I even started to question if I ever played it at all, despite owning the physical copy and definitely remembering songs like NGO and Paranoia Hades. But once the Japanese version got its own set on retro achievements, that was my opportunity to delve back into what was one of the biggest enigmas of my young adult years relating to my DDR fanboy phase. As it turns out, yeah, there was a reason. And I knew that this was an opinion that could not go unjustified. So let's get the basic stuff out of the way first. In the options menu, the timing adjustment has its own dedicated menu now, which makes more sense than hiding it in the sound menu, which is still unfortunately the case in the US version. It's one of the first things that you have to adjust before doing anything else in order to play efficiently, and now it's more convenient for the player to find. In addition, this menu now has two offset numbers, one for judgment and one for display. However, upon experimenting with both, they pretty much just do the same thing, inching the step chart earlier or later in relation to the music, so basically the only reason to change the second number is if you really need to offset the timing even further than 6.0. And yeah, the numbers themselves have been changed from whole numbers to 0.4 increments. It doesn't really alter the offset timing process though, since plus 0.4 does the same thing as a plus 1 from previous iterations, so I didn't really see the necessity behind the change. Lastly, the menu contains a test feature that immediately drops you into a playthrough of Freeway Shuffle on Basic to see if the timing is good to go, which saves a good amount of time compared to having to go into training mode every time you change the number. Or at least it should. One thing I noticed during my time with this game is that the chart synchronization with the music seems to be inconsistent between songs. I didn't know if it was present in any of the other games prior or later, but it was definitely noticeable here. It's not enough to interfere much with getting full combos, but it does make getting AAAs more cumbersome if you're willing to go through with adjusting the timing with virtually every song you play. Otherwise, you just have to adjust your own personal inputs to compensate, which is pretty much inevitable when playing courses. Some songs I had to set to plus 2.4 offset, others I had to set to plus 1.6. Whether this is a deal breaker or not will depend on what you're looking to get out of the game, but it's definitely going to agitate those who care about precision. Whether it bothers you or not, however, it's definitely not something that should be overlooked, especially when the Marvelous Judgment timing is so damn precise. Speaking of which, you know how the Marvelous Judgment for arrows was usually a small optional thing that was present in other DDR entries that didn't really impact them in very meaningful ways? Well, now they're just a natural part of the gameplay, and they have the same timing window size as they did in SuperNOVA. To compensate, the AAAs have been made easier to obtain. They're no longer restricted to earning perfect full combos, now you just have to get at least 990,000 points for it. It's even possible to miss an arrow or two and still get a AAA. I've always had the opinion that the highest ranking in a rhythm game like this should allow for even just a little bit of room for error, and I'm glad that this entry started to do that, even if the chart-to-music desynchronization wasn't present. Some of the old songs from the classics now have a special step chart that essentially try to specialize in one of the Groove Radar traits like D2R Freeze Special or Dynamite Rave Air Special, and they kinda suck. The way the steps were charted seemed like they were too focused on having an abundance of a trait in exchange for the chart itself being good. For what they were trying to be, it's entirely possible to make these charts utilize their respective gimmicks in a way that works in tandem with the nature of the music and player ability to make a reasonably designed and ergo enjoyable challenge. They could have made the whole special thing work here, but they didn't. Now let's talk about this game's take on the mission mode formula, Hypermaster Mode. Honestly, this has to be one of the laziest mission modes I've seen in a DDR game yet. There are groups of missions that are each accompanied by a sort of boss mission, but you can just beat the boss mission to unlock the next group. At least up to a point. Beating all the boss missions in the first 10 groups will unlock a separate set of missions for double play, which is a first in DDR history, but eventually you will have to complete all the missions in said 10 groups in order to unlock the next group. It's a very questionable method of unlocking missions, to say the least. It would have been more reasonable to just clear a handful of normal missions to unlock the boss mission, then clear said boss mission to unlock the next group. Then, if the player wants, they can go back to previous groups to tackle uncleared missions to contribute to unlocking the following group. But even then, the only reason to go through this mode is to make songs available for purchase in the shop for the standard arcade mode, but by the time you're done with Hypermaster Mode, the only things left to see are the harder step charts that weren't present there. The missions themselves are very passive. For pretty much all of them, yeah, not even most of them, for pretty much all of them, you just have to play like you do in a regular game mode, as if you were just gunning for FCs or double A's. Finish a song with your dance meter at least 80% full, get a combination of 50 greats and perfects, get a max combo of 70 or more, don't miss more than 15 arrows, etc. Basically just things that you already do in a typical game session. Not once did I come across a mission that asked you to do anything out of the ordinary, and they all have you play each respective song from start to finish. There were a couple that alter the playing field, like staircasing the step zone, or stacking the arrows on top of each other, swapping the left and right arrow positions, etc., but for the most part, they didn't even really prove to offer much more of a challenge anyway. There's also this really cool idea that was put into practice, but its potential was just wasted. Your default dancer is a Consento, and you can customize its appearance with all sorts of modules that affect gameplay depending on what you equip. Some make the dance meter easier to replenish, others increase the number of perfects you get at the results screen, and some even change your Consento's appearance to one of the game's other dancers. There are also challenge modules that make the game harder, but gives you what's called a hyper score that behaves independently of the standard score, and the difficulty of the modules affects said score. This idea of having a custom Consento where you can create custom builds to take into different missions that warrant different outcomes could have been utilized in such a unique way that could encourage the player to experiment with different combinations if the potential reward warranted it. But unfortunately, there's really no reason to even mess with it at all. Rewards are unlocked by just clearing and even attempting missions, and the hyperscores don't even amount to anything. Equipping the Expert module fails the player whether they meet the mission's condition or not, which defeats the purpose of even having it since you can just go into the standard game mode for that. It's just a thing that's there to be there and no other reason. Now I understand why I didn't remember anything about Dance Dance Revolution SuperNOVA 2. It's because there was nothing to remember. Not only is it a major downgrade from the entry that preceded it, but it's just so unremarkable, which is a shame because the custom module idea has a lot of potential that wasn't fully realized. Not helping is the fact that it was tacked on to a lazy master mode that didn't really demand anything from the player outside of just playing it like you'd play any other DDR game. It also has this weird clear meter thing, but that doesn't amount to anything either. If this was an early PS2 game, I probably would have been more lenient towards the concept, but then there's the inconsistent music to chart synchronization, which is made much more apparent because of the Marvelous Judgment not just being made a natural part of the game, but also having missions and modules built around it. So not only is this a forgettable entry in the DDR series, but it's legitimately bad. In fact, this might be the worst one I've played so far. I wasn't expecting this to top what came out before it, not even a little bit, but I wasn't expecting to flat out dislike it either. I had been curious for a while as to why I forgot virtually everything about this entry, but I guess some entries are just better off forgotten. I'm giving Dance Dance Revolution SuperNOVA 2 for the PlayStation 2 a 3 out of 10. I'm the Negative Ion. See ya.